Treason is not the reason for the season. Episode 6, Militia Act of 1792 and the Whiskey Rebellion. With the Constitution and Bill of Rights ratified, Congress then passed, and Washington signed into law, the Militia Act of 1792. This law required that states create and maintain militias. It required that all able-bodied men register with their state militia. It granted the President authority to take charge of state militias in times of foreign invasions or to put down internal insurrections. The Militia Act of 1792 designed militias to act as a supplement to the full-time army. It stated that militia members shall be paid the same as the full-time army. It stated that militia members shall be subject to the same laws of warfare as the full-time army. It stated that militia members shall be subject to the laws of court-martial, fines, and imprisonment, for disobeying orders, the same as the full-time army. The Militia Act of 1792 shows exactly how the founders intended the Second Amendment to operate. Able-bodied men were required to register with their state militias. States would train these men and maintain them in militias. And the federal government could call upon the states to provide militias for defense of the nation as a whole when needed. The Militia Act of 1792 stated that one reason the president could activate the militias was to put down insurrections. The founders did not design militias to exist to rebel against the state. The Constitution defined armed rebellion as treason, and it states that militias operate under their commander-in-chief, the president. The Second Amendment states militias are for the defense of the state. And the Militia Act states that men must register for militia service, anonymity is not allowed, and that the president can call up a militia to put down insurrections. Anonymous civilians hoarding unregistered guns to rise up in insurrection to overthrow the government is exactly not what the founders designed into the founding documents of the nation. Militias were designed start to finish to operate under government control, defend the state, and put down insurrections. The Militia Act of 1792 worked with the Constitution and Second Amendment to grant federal control of state militias. It also worked with state constitutions to specifically list what arms were required for militia service. For states with no state constitutional right to bear arms, the Constitution and Second Amendment mandated that those states allow arms for militia service. The Militia Act of 1792 explicitly defined what arms for militia service meant. Arms required for militia service, arms that all states would have to allow, was limited by the Militia Act of 1792 to be 1 musket, 24 shot, and a quarter pound of powder. States with no state constitutional right to bear arms or with a state constitutional right to bear arms for militia service only, would only have to allow people to possess 1 musket and ammo for 24 shots. All other arms, as well as how those arms were carried in times of peace, how they were stored when not used for militia service, could be regulated within those states as they so desired. By 1792, one of the biggest challenges for the newly formed federal government was to pay off the debts that had accumulated during the Revolutionary War. One of the very first taxes the federal government came up with was a tax on distilled spirits. In the U.S. this mainly meant whiskey, so it was called the whiskey tax. Some people didn't like the whiskey tax. In July 1794, a mob of over 500 armed men, some who had fought in the Revolutionary War, attacked the home of the tax inspector in Pennsylvania, and opposed by force the federal government's first attempt to collect a tax. This became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. President George Washington used the Militia Act to call up an army of 13,000 militiamen provided by several states, and in October 1794, Washington personally marched that army to Pennsylvania and put down the rebellion. Just to put that into perspective, 13,000 militiamen was a force of men bigger than any group of American soldiers ever assembled in any one area during the whole of the Revolutionary War. And just to be clear, many of the men in Shays' Rebellion and many of the men in the Whiskey Rebellion had served either in Washington's Continental Army or in militias and had fought the British during the Revolutionary War just 10 years earlier. They included former military/militia servicemen, and when they turned to rebellion, the founders didn't say, well, they're militia, and rebellion is what militias are for. Rather, the founders did everything in their powers to make sure the federal government could put down such rebellions immediately via the Constitution, Bill of Rights, and Militia Act of 1792. And when operating under those documents and faced with the Whiskey Rebellion, Washington immediately crushed it with a militia under his command. The point here is clear: the Militia Act of 1792 shows beyond any doubt that the founders saw militias as government-regulated, government-controlled, government-commanded, armies that operate subservient to the government, under the commander-in-chief, the president, as an extension of the full-time army, for the explicit purpose of repelling foreign invasions and putting down internal rebellions. The fact that they explicitly state in the law that putting down internal rebellions is one of reasons militias exist should show just how preposterous the militia as terrorism idea is. Treason is not the reason for the Second Amendment. Treason is not the reason for the season.